So as I said before, welcome to this event from the Mint House. If you're not aware of who we are, if you haven't been to one of our events before or you don't know us, we are a centre for restorative justice and practice based in Oxford. And among many things, one of the things that we do is we put on events such as these to help people within the sector and outside of the sector sometimes as well, develop thinking and practice with the aim of making restorative justice and practice more widely used and embedded in a variety of settings. Today, we're looking at this topic of the use of restorative justice in prisons, which is something that we're interested in. And obviously quite a few of you also are, having joined us today. We're really aware that this is nothing new, that work has been going on in this area for many years, but with mixed success. So we wanted to look at it today to see what we can do to make it more widely used, sort of move forward with this in the UK particularly. So today we're going to be looking at the question, what next steps in terms of policy and practice are required in order to embed and mainstream restorative justice into HM prisons? Which is a big question, but hopefully at least we'll cover a little bit of that today. Today's event, we're going to be using a fishbowl discussion format, which you saw when you registered. And I'm just going to put up quickly an image to help illustrate that. So the way that will work is that we have 4 invited speakers or conversationalists joining us today, who I'll introduce in a moment, and they will form this initial inner circle. And then everyone else who's here today is part of the outer circle, sort of observing that discussion. But if you would like to join in the discussion, you are very welcome to. So please, later on when I say if anyone would like to join the discussion, and we'll open it up for people to join that inner circle to discuss, please use the raise hand function, the little Zoom raise hand, that will help me identify who would like to discuss and make a comment or ask a question, be part of that discussion. And we're hoping this will be different to a sort of a standard question and answer panel discussion. In that hopefully it'll be a more organic discussion that's a bit more back and forth rather than just simply questions and answers. So we'll see how it goes. We're hoping that this way lots of people can contribute and share their insights, and we can hear from a lot of different people. So also because of this, if you do decide to join the inner circle and be part of the discussion, it'd be helpful if you could try to keep your comments concise and brief if possible, just so that we give as much opportunity to other people to be involved as possible. So it's a bit of an experiment. We're going to see how it goes, but we're really excited to have you all here today. So now kicking off the rest of today's session, I'm just going to really briefly introduce those 4 initial speakers or conversationalists that have joined us today. Today we have Geoff Emerson with us, who worked in the probation service for 40 years. And he worked in a couple of different prisons, but also was involved in managing a Thames Valley probation trial as part of a government-funded random control trial to test the effectiveness of restorative justice and mainstreaming restorative justice. And since retirement, he's also been involved in a number of other restorative justice projects, and he's currently one of the trustees of the Mint House. So it's great to have you here today, Geoff. Jim Simon is the Chief Executive Officer of the Restorative Justice Council. And he also currently chairs the all-party parliamentary group for Restorative Justice Advisory Board. So he's very much thinking about how we can also relate this to government policy, etc., which is helpful. Sam Warman is the head of programs at Belong, a charity that provides restorative mentoring and therapeutic interventions for those in the criminal justice system, both in prison and in the community. And until recently, he ran Belong's restorative justice service at HMP Coldingley. So it'll be great to hear his impressions of how it works in a prison setting. He will also, I'm hoping, be representing some of the views of the RJ reps that work with Belong inside prison to support the use of restorative justice within prison and within the prison population. We would have loved to have some of those people here today, but it wasn't possible for that to be the case, but hopefully he can share some of their perspectives with us. And then last but very much not least, we have Cheryl Tanner, who's the Chief Executive Officer for Sussex Pathways, which is a criminal justice charity working across Sussex. and at HMP Lewis, and she's the strategic lead for Sussex Pathways with the Sussex Restorative Justice Partnership. So it'd be great now to start off our discussion. So like I said, the question I'm posing today is what next steps in terms of policy and practice are required in order to embed and mainstream restorative justice into HM prisons? So Geoff, would you like to start off with a few observations or thoughts on that question to share with us? And I'll ask the other contributors as well before we kind of discuss a bit more generally.
Okay, yes. Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Right. Well, I think I'm an expert on this subject because I speak from a position of failure. And also recent relative ignorance. But the position of failure is that having struggled with this since 2001, in Bullingdon in particular, which is the prison that I know best, I think I've been involved with and coordinated and run at least 3 projects that I would say were successful projects. But if you looked today for the evidence of the success of RJ in Bullingdon Prison, I don't actually think you'd find very much. I think so in terms of actually being able to make the sort of jelly stick to the wall, it's just been unsuccessful in terms of embedding. I was also involved but this is about 2012 to about 2014, 15, with a national rollout to probation and prisons that at the time, I mean, I think it was a very good effort, but at times both probation and prisons were being reorganised. So all the people who were trained in prisons were quickly moved to other roles and posts because of something called fair and sustainable. It might have been fair, but from an RJ point of view, it wasn't very sustainable. Why doesn't RJ stick when so many initiatives seem well, no, not seem, that it's more evidence tested than most other interventions, and it comes out well. So why is it difficult to make it stick and make it sustainable? And I think the previous Labour government was quite successful embedding RJ into the youth justice system, but it's simply not it's simply not embedded in the adult system because, and I think in relation to the first piece of research I was involved with Joanna Shapland, it just shows how resistant the criminal justice system is to change. It's complex and resistant, and it's a kind of rigidity. And that's most sort of exemplified in prisons, as well as other bits of the system, including probation too. I don't think COVID has helped. But all of that is rather depressing and looks kind of backward. So trying to look more optimistically, where next in our current difficult circumstances? I think promoting political will, there's a peculiar irony that really crime only gets high on the political agenda when it's about reactions and punitive approaches promoted by the press and so-called penal populism. And really, there's very rarely a reformist agenda that those in RJ would like to see. I think if we're looking at things more locally, you need a top-down commitment and a bottom-up commitment. Senior management isn't enough. I've been working with some very committed governors, and also staff at the bottom who are sort of supportive of RJ can often be isolated. So resources are necessary. Organisational will, and I think it's a big problem for RJ because from a prison's perspective, it looks like risk. And it looks like a risky activity to be involved in. So you're starting with a struggle from that point of view, but you need inspiring champions, and we've got people on the panel today who are those inspiring champions. But my example and my suggestion is that we somehow need to get it written into our law and penal code. Now, that has happened with a piece of legislation that was described as declaratory legislation when it became a purpose of sentencing in the early 2000s, but we need it as a purpose in prison as well. I think the other thing to say is RJ in prisons isn't just one thing. It's doing RJ where prisoners initiate it. It's doing RJ where victims on the outside have initiated it. But it's also replacing the adjudication system, which all prison governors universally understand that it's in chaos and doesn't work. So it can replace or complement an RJ. So there are things that can be done, but it needs to be written into law. And I work with colleagues in Germany, and the good Ministry of Justice in Schleswig-Holstein has it written into their penal code that RJ is fundamentally involved in prisons and in community penalties. So it can be done. And the other bit of optimism comes from, I've been working in RJ in prisons for 20 years, but when the people that I was involved with the research project originally said we should be looking at a 30 to 40 year time scale of cultural change, something similar to the kind of cultural change of the abolition of slavery, which still isn't completely abolished, obviously. So we need to be looking at that kind of time scale. But we've only got 20 years to go if we're going to manage to do it in 40 years, since I've been at it for 20 years. But that's my initial thoughts, and it's a struggle, but I'm optimistic about the struggle.
Thanks, Geoff. And Jim, do you have anything that you want to share, or anything off the back of what Geoff has said as well?
Yeah, thanks, Joy, and Geoff, thanks very much for your insights, many of which reflect probably what I'm going to say as well. So, when we were first posed this question, my mind went in two different directions, and the easiest way to sort of explain that is that there's the outward facing work that happens around prisons, i.e. as Geoff was saying, the work that's done with victims, the work that's commissioned by police and crime commissioners to happen, and then there's the inward facing work, which is how do we use and embed restorative practices within the way that we work within our prisons. I think for me, I'd like to start with this outward facing RJ, and we know across the RJ sector that there are huge concerns with the way that the current procedures and processes that are in place are impacting, quite often to the detriment of victims of crime. We as a membership organisation consistently hear about challenges that practitioners are facing, particularly in accessing prisons to meet with offenders to talk about restorative justice. And it's causing frustration, not only to practitioners, but to victims as well. And some of the examples that we're given, there is significant concern by those who feel that they are being left behind. They're not being given the opportunity to access something that they feel is really important to them and will help them to move forward. When you look at the current system, I understand and accept that the Ministry of Justice, HMPPS, need to have some oversight as to what is happening within the prison estate. They do have a responsibility to ensure that any restorative justice that happens is appropriate and that it's safe for both victims and offenders. And I also accept that they have a wealth of information that practitioners outside of a prison won't have that can help identify what those potential risks are. My concern with the current process is that it's been put in place without any real significant thought of the impact. It is underfunded, under-resourced, which leads to these delays. And the reality of that is that we're denying victims and offenders an opportunity to move on. The answer for me is that process needs more resource put into it. It needs to be reviewed and restructured, and that the restorative sector needs to be part of that. Where I have concern is that the current government's position on RJ is a real concern. On the surface, there's a commitment, but when you start looking slightly below the surface, and their response to the recent victims bill is a prime example. They start using words like, we are very committed in appropriate cases, but we don't consider that a right to access restorative justice is practical or appropriate. They made a commitment to raise awareness for victims and offenders around restorative justice, but then there's no evidence that that's happened. We're 6 months on from when that commitment was made, and the conversations that we're still having with the MOJ are that no detail has come around about that. So we find ourselves again in a position a bit like Geoff was saying, where time is ticking along and actually we're not moving with it, and commitments are great, but action is what is needed. We've asked, and the sector has asked consistently for a clear and detailed action plan for what RJ would look like, to include what it would look like within the prison system, but wider criminal justice sector. And the response again from government is that it's an unnecessary task, it's additional red tape, and would hinder progress. Well, actually, if there's no plan, what we're saying is there's no plan, there's nothing to work towards, and there's nothing to be held accountable for. Unlike our counterparts in Scotland and Northern Ireland, who have made very clear commitments. And then alongside that, I was thinking about opportunities within prison, and you don't have to look at the news too often to see that there are concerns with growing violence in prison, the impact that this has on those that are housed there, but also the staff. We know that the prison service is under-resourced, and the answer to that is that let's just keep putting people in with no real thought as to how do we keep our existing staff safe. Evidence tells us that effective early intervention can significantly improve well-being. It can potentially reduce conflict, which quite often within a prison environment, and those who work within prison environments, I'm sure will agree, that one conflict can then lead to something bigger, which then leads to a big crisis and lots of other issues across the estate. I believe that if we start looking at restorative ways of working inside the prison, we get to understand the root causes, and we get to support individuals to deal with that immediate conflict, but also start teaching them skills to prevent that happening again in the future. And this type of approach leads to a calmer environment. It leads to a safer space for people to be in, and benefits not only the offenders that are housed there, but also the staff that are working with them, so that they can come into work and feel safe. But again, it needs a commitment from HMPPS to do that. We're aware that there are prisons who are very effectively doing that. Others have no interest at all. There's no consistency, and the siloed working that we see actually isn't helpful in coming up with a model, and it needs significant change. But it needs more than a word of commitment from the government to do that. It needs the action behind it. So yeah, hopefully that's gives a bit of a sense of where my thinking is.
Thanks, Jim. Sam, would you like to talk a little bit about your thoughts on this question and your experiences of doing work with your organisation?
Yeah, having previously just been working for 5 years, running a restorative justice service at HMP Coldenley, I've recently had conversations with a rep there who is a prisoner there, who's been trained in our restorative approaches and kind of managing our RJ project in terms with, he's got some other volunteers around him who are also RJ trained and residents within the prison. And I think, as has already been mentioned today, one of the biggest issues is just the inconsistency within prisons, I think, as Jim just said, because as much as these people residing within the prison can use their restorative approaches, without the staff being on board with it, it gets lost along the way. And particularly, as has been touched on with the adjudication process, it is all still so punitive. And in terms of resolving conflicts, adjudications, that it doesn't resolve any conflict. It has an outcome in terms of a punitive approach, but it doesn't ever seem to resolve the issues. And there's all sorts of problems with how adjudications are run within prisons in terms of people are taking blame for other people and stuff. It's not really designed to resolve any sort of conflict, more just that punitive approach. And there's a real culture as well, from my experience, of moving people from one prison estate to another, which has a really, particularly if, as you say, some prisons have a good kind of RJ setup, others non-existent. So you could be moving someone who's, you know, used to that kind of situation of being involved around people that use kind of restorative approaches, then plonk them in a prison where they've never even heard of it. And I think in terms of trying to get it actively up and running within prisons so that it's useful just for the residents and for the staff, one of the biggest challenges is, and I know it's not an easy resolution, but is the staff turnover, because we can go in to a service and train a section of staff, which we've done before. Within a couple of months, half of that staff has moved on, because a lot of there are on kind of placements and stuff like that. So there's a lot of movement, and then before you know it, you've got a whole new batch of kind of staff coming in there who have got, again, no experience of RJ. So when they're trying to interact with our guys that are trained, they're not as supportive because they're not really aware of the kind of restorative approach. It feels like a constant battle. You know, we've been in this one prison for like 5 years, and it's proved successful in terms of how it's managed conflicts for those involved, for those that live in the prison. But in terms of like a longer term project, you're just having to repeat yourself over and over again to make sure that staff are aware of what we're there for, and kind of what the restorative approach is. But I think until everything is streamlined in that kind of way of thinking, it's always going to be a barrier, because you've got, you know, like the OMU departments within prison, they don't have, quite a lot of my experiences, they don't have a kind of a knowledge of restorative justice and, you know, the possibilities with meeting victims, you know, outside of the prison and that kind of thing. So it's hard to expect the residents to really take it up when it's not reflected by the kind of staff that are around them. So for me, I feel like it's just, it's fundamentally missing from the whole criminal justice system. From my previous role before I joined Belong was I worked for the Met Police for 10 years, and no one ever mentioned restorative justice to me once when I was there. Never heard of it. So, you know, and that's all part of the process. You're going through the court system, coming into the prison, and it's never mentioned. And then suddenly a prisoner might approach me at some point going, "Oh, I heard you run a restorative justice program. Can I meet my victim?" and all this kind of stuff. And it's like they've never been made aware of that ever before. A lot of them don't know what it even involves. So it's, yeah, for me, there's a lot of barriers in terms of the whole criminal justice process, really, and the huge staff turnovers and just the way the prison's kind of adjudication system is. It's not effective as far as I'm concerned. It gets an end goal in terms of someone gets the punishment for something they've supposedly done, but it doesn't actually help the prison move forward with conflict.
Thanks, Sam. That's really helpful to hear your experiences, and those are the RJ reps as well. Cheryl, would you like to say a few things?
Yeah, so thank you, Geoff, Jim and Sam. You know, really, really interesting. I've got a few points on this. And I think one of the big things is that we have to go beyond prison governors. We have to go higher. You know, the prison directorates, politicians. But until you demystify RJ in prisons, you are never going to get anywhere. Because I've worked in prisons all over. I'm based in Lewis Prison. You get a new governor come in, they go, oh no, it's too dangerous for the prison. Oh, you know, can't be doing that. And then they'll allow RJ with victims coming in, but they don't allow restorative practices within the prison, between prisoners, between officers and prisoners, even between officers, because no, we can't do that. So you have to demystify it somehow for them. Now, down in Rochester Prison, and this was about 6 years ago, we had the governor down there, brilliant governor, said, do you know what, Shell? He said, I love what you do down here with RJ. He said, train up my staff. He said, and then from training up my staff, we can train up peer mentors and we can really have RJ in the prison. So Mary Hinton and I, we trained up 15 of their staff in Rochester. And then 2 months later, unfortunately, the governor retired, got a new governor in, and new governor went, don't know about this, never went anywhere. We had T-shirts made for the prison officers so that they took off their uniform, they wore an RJ, they had a different hat on, but it was just wasted money, absolutely wasted money. So for me, you've got to go above the prison governors, you know, as Geoff said, as Jim said, and Sam, you've got to get it really embedded in policy, because if you don't get it embedded in policy, it's never going to work. The other thing is as well, and I know probably, Joy, I shouldn't be saying this, but I'm going to go for it anyway. You've got to get past Clifford, Grimmerson and rehab. You know, I mean, there's your red tape straight away. There's your red tape. I've spoken to lots of people who are on this call, you know, and Clifford is trying to put in so many boundaries, so many sort of different ways that people are allowed to work in the prisons. The OMU, the governor's going, oh no, you haven't been through rehab, so can't do that. Well, hang on a minute, who is rehab? Can anybody here really and honestly tell me what rehab is? Is it MOJ? Is it government? What is rehab? It's run by 2 people, and all, you know, great respect to Clifford, you know, he's tried to do a really good job on this, but they're piling money into something that they are not talking to people on this call. They're not talking to Jim and the RJC. They're not talking above the governors. They're just doing their own thing. Who are they? You know, I've been doing RJ for a long, long time. I have really built up our service. We've been through the RJC. We've got accredited training. We've got accredited trainers, you know, but then you get the rehab and you're like, okay, what do we do now? Because we can't go forward because we're blocked. And we do in Sussex, we do in RJ in so many different prisons, because as Sam said, prisoners are shipped out, but that shouldn't stop them doing RJ. So we go to different prisons. Some prisons are amazing and they have a SPOC there and they will really facilitate you. Other prisons will block you. Well, you've not gone through Clifford. If you haven't gone through Clifford, you can't do RJ. So then you're denying that victim. You're denying that victim a voice because rehab are going, no, you haven't come through us. We've got to think of the bigger picture. This is about victims' voices. And if we can embed it in the politician, in the I cannot say this, but I do apologize, everybody, but the legislation, if we can embed it in that, we can go forward. But all the time you've got this red tape, it is not going to happen. So we need to go higher, we need to go further, and we need to go harder to be able to do this, because otherwise we are just going to carry on doing what we've done for the last 10, 15 years, and we're still going to be here in the next 10, 15 years. You know, I know Jim is really battling this big time, and he's such a brilliant advocate, but Jim needs the backing of everybody on this call behind him. So yeah, that's all I've got, Joy.
Thanks, Jill. I also want to say we did invite Clifford to take part today as one of our sort of speakers in this inner circle, but he decided not to be involved. So I just wanted to say that I haven't intentionally left him out of this conversation. We had invited him. Jim, Sam, Geoff, anything else in the back of that? I'm particularly interested in this question of what can we do at the higher levels? What, do you have any suggestions or thoughts about how we can best move forward and try to tackle that?
I mean, just from a kind of prison-based way of thinking, it needs, I understand there's a lot that needs to change all through the criminal justice network, but as part of perhaps staff's training, when they go through their whole process of learning the role, RJ needs to be part of that. If we're going to struggle to get that training done when staff come into the prison, then it needs to be part of that actual remit in terms of their job, because it's a huge part of resolving conflicts within prison. So for me, it stands to reason that that should be part of a kind of standard way of developing an officer's training, and it needs to divert away from this culture of just moving the problem on. I mean, particularly in London jails and some of the prisons we work up in the Midlands, the gang culture within prisons is huge, and the way it's been dealt with is a prisoner just has a long list of names they cannot associate with, and they'll try their very best to keep them apart in all different parts of a prison, which is nigh on impossible. But there's no real way of managing or approach to manage that conflict. It is just very much like, let's keep everyone apart. We don't get involved in that. Let's just make sure no one comes into contact. And it's not sustainable, with prisons full to the brim. That can't go on as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, Sam, I have put the message in the box that Lewis are allowing us to do this. So any new officers that come through, they do get an RJ awareness course from us. It's only part of their bite-sized training, but every officer gets it. That's now. Great. I'm really grateful to Lewis for that, but it's needed in every prison. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Jim, we've had a couple of questions about what is rehab. I know you've obviously had some interactions with them. Could you just give a brief overview of what rehab is and its role at the moment? Yeah, and any comments you want to make as well.
Cheryl was right in terms of, is there a single definition of rehab? That's very hard to pinpoint, but essentially was set up to provide oversight across the prison estate, so that HMPPS could be confident that restorative work that was going on, and primarily this focused on restorative work with victims and offenders, rather than in the initial stages what was happening inside prisons. And it was to make sure that practice is of high quality, that it's safe for all that participate, and we don't need to say it, but I will say it. They are the fundamental principles behind RJ, and we can all get behind those. But that process has grown and developed, and has become more of a hindrance to RJ happening, rather than providing the oversight that's there. And as I sort of touched on in my initial comments, the main issue is that we've set up a process which, as Cheryl said, rehab is in essence two people that work in there, covering all of the prisons across the UK. It's significantly under-resourced. They haven't got the capacity to do what they want to do. They haven't got the capacity to do oversight. And rather than admitting that that's the case, we just delay what's happening. So, we certainly, I'm aware of people who have been waiting 3+ years. Now, COVID obviously factors into that, and there were periods of times when prisons were closed down, and again, fully accept and would expect that there would be delays because of that. The whole of our society sort of ground to a halt. But at some point we have to move past that, and COVID can no longer be the excuse for that. We should now be up and running, but we've got no further forward. So that's a bit about rehab. In terms of the national picture, my biggest concern is that with a lot of the government policy that's being developed, we're always looking at how do we fix what's already broken, what plasters can we stick on. There's never any thought about what it could look like. What's the alternative to this? I was particularly disturbed to see a tweet a few months ago with Dominic Raab, the then Justice Minister, before he left and came back again, celebrating that we'd opened a new prison. And it's like, why is that something to celebrate? The fact that we can now lock up more people is not something to be on Twitter celebrating. Actually, we should be celebrating, we need to close one because it's not needed. So I think the thinking is all wrong. And the thinking is always about how do we do, what's the next sticking plaster? And those plasters will only stick for a little bit and then it's broken again. So there is a huge amount of work, but it's making these policy makers aware of what it could be and what it should be, and moving them away from old backward thinking that, we can just lock people up and punish our way out of a difficult situation, which is never going to be the answer.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to open up opportunity for some people to join our inner circle now. And Patricia, I'm aware that you've had your hand up for a while and also made some comments in the chat. But is there anything else that you want to add, sort of based on this question of what next steps in terms of policy and practice are needed in the UK? I know that you're not based in the UK from your comments. I think you're in Canada.
Yeah, no, I'm actually based in Ireland, but I don't know if any of you guys have heard an organisation called the Turnaround Project. They're based in Northern Ireland, I believe. So I'm actually going to be interviewed by them. So in relation to, so I'm about to start doing what they call peer mentorship through another organisation, and using a process called EFT tapping, which is, I don't know if you know what tapping is. Yeah, anyhow. Yeah, but my comment would be, it's very difficult to create policies unless you have people who are incarcerated currently or who have been incarcerated, because the idea of peer mentorship is don't do anything about me without me. You have to have people sitting at the table that have that lived experience. I mean, you can have all the degrees, you can have, I liked what Sam had to say, but it's interesting, but not surprising. Being an ex-police officer, that they get no training in, a lot of people don't even know what, you say that to a politician, they're like, restorative justice, what's that? They're totally clueless about it. And I think that's wrong because, when I see on the news and stuff like that, like what happens, so say you have a crime that's committed, my first thought is, well, that's terrible. My second thought is, what brought that person to that point in their life that they ended up doing what they did? Does that make sense? So, and that's why I think where restorative justice comes in, because there's a lot of intergenerational trauma going on, like whether it's gangs or whatever, like, you only do what you know for a time and a period in your life. Whereas if you're taught a different way, then it can potentially, I'm not saying it will be, it can potentially be an alternative to living a life of crime. I mean, a lot of the kids and some of the interviews that I've heard, or some of the people that are on them, they started doing crime when they were 6 and 7 years of age because they grew up in almost sheer destitution. So like poverty and socioeconomic issues, that plays a massive part into the whole idea of having inmates. Something else I said, victims versus prisoners, they're all people. So out of respect for people, I don't like it when someone says, well, you're an ex-inmate. Like, what the hell is that like? I'm not an ex-inmate, I'm a person. I have to breathe, my heart has to tick. I don't, and I have the experience of both. So I've been both a victim and I've been an inmate. So I have that empathy that I can look from both perspectives. So yeah, I don't know. That's just how I see it. Yeah. Okay, I'll shut up.
Hear your experiences, thank you. And I think a good reminder that we need to make sure that all voices are involved when making these policy decisions, and also when speaking to the powers that be, helping them to understand people's experiences and the power of restorative justice. I think a lot of,
it is happening here.
They understand, but a lot of people never have have heard about it, so they don't understand how well it can work.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes it can just be easier to show. Like the organizations I'm working with, one of them is called Spear Anew and the other one is the Turnaround Project. So one is in Southern Ireland, the other one is in the north. And then I have my own kind of little thing that's going on. You know, basically teaching people that, okay, so you messed up, but here's the alternative. You know, a lot of the time people have no self-confidence, they have no self-esteem, their self-worth is like minus zero sort of thing. So, and I know they are doing some work with, I think it's the Irish Penal Reform Trust. So they're making moves in Ireland. And I know you're talking more about the English system, but we're next door neighbors, so it's impossible not to have influence.
Yeah, no, there's a lot. I think there is a lot that we can learn from the way it works in other parts of the world as well. I'm just going to move on so that we have a chance to hear other people's contributions as well. Jenna, I think you would also put your hand up. Is there something that you would like to share?
Hi, yeah, thank you. I just wanted to say that I 100% agree with the points that Cheryl has raised. Unfortunately, I think there's sort of two strands to this debate, which is firstly the embedding in prisons more widely in a political and government level, but there's also the day-to-day practice. And what I'm concerned about is that if things keep going the way they're going, what is the reputation of RJ in prisons going to be like, and is there going to be anything left for us to work with because of the impact that rehab is having at the moment? I agree that there needs to be some standardization for safety, absolutely, and I understand how they've come about, but some of the issues that have been raised, such as the high turnover of staff, I think could be easily resolved with input from services at a local level. If they can, you know, a lot of staff spend a lot of time and money working towards their accreditation to prove that they are able to risk assess cases, to prove that they're able to work to a certain standard. And it feels a lot like that's now being taken away and is almost becoming slightly worthless. We have a case at the moment that has been on hold for 7 months, for example. We've now been told that a decision about suitability is going to be made with that person by the prison psychologist and offender manager. I absolutely accept that they have a wealth of knowledge that's very different to ours. However, having worked in a prison, I also know that they will be seen as having quite a lot of weight and power over that person's sentence outcomes, especially as a life sentence prisoner. So what they might say to him might be very different to what we might say, and that decisions are being made by people who aren't trained in restorative justice. Decisions are being made without any input from the harmer or the harmed person at times. We're sort of standardizing based on offence type. Is this suitable, without looking at their individual resilience, protective factors, support, any of that sort of stuff. And the decision is being taken away from practitioners. And I just think that that's really, really harmful and really inappropriate.
Yeah, thank you, Jenna. I've seen several people have their hands up, so I think what I might do is just kind of go to each of those people in turn so that people can say what they're hoping to say, and then perhaps after that we can kind of have a bit more back and forth about some of those comments. David, you also had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Joy. I'll be as brief as I can, just given we are running out of time. But you heard a lot from Jim. I think the point that Geoff made about how difficult it is to bring about change in the restorative justice system is really important. But also the point Cheryl made about the culture, the organisational culture within the CJS being fundamentally not restorative. And I think that applies, frankly, to the police just as much to prisons. You know, you look even at police forces that are advocates of restorative justice. Well, are they applying it within their own organisation? And sadly, I think the answer, by and large, to that question would be no, they're not. I mean, in terms of solutions, I do think the point about going higher than governors is really important. This thing, I mean, it is a centralised system at the moment, a highly centralised system that we have in terms of the prisons. So politicians have a role, but top managers, chief execs, corporate directors, they've all got a really important role to play. But also, and I hope this doesn't sound contradictory, it's interesting how devolution plays into all of this, because I do think some of the problems are about, you know, people at a local level in the criminal justice system not being allowed to develop and innovate and be creative, you know, in their own areas, in partnerships that work for them. And so we need a consistent system. Of course we do, across, you know, the whole of England. Of course we have completely separate systems in Northern Ireland and Scotland, but within that consistency there needs to be enough devolution of responsibility to support creativity and innovation.
Thanks, David. Rosie.
Yeah, again, I suppose just trying to be solution focused. Actually, just in preparation for this session, I took a little look, and I was honestly wowed by the amount of work going on. So Belong have been doing great stuff in the Mount and Wormwood Scrubs and Coldingley and Rinsford and Isis and Feltham, and Remedy doing stuff in Doncaster and Humber, and Sodexo in Peterborough and Bronzefield, and then the work Shell's involved in, and Geoff's described, but also Restorative Solutions, and I think Restorative Thinking has done some prison work as well. So I suppose my question really to the panel members is, are there things we might think of doing to, if you like, surface and share what is already going on more overtly than is currently happening, and celebrate it, and as part of that giving voice to people with lived experience as has been described, and then also learning from it, because a message from previous evaluations is that often they're not robust enough, or the numbers are too short, so maybe they're small, so maybe there are opportunities to join forces and aim for some more ambitious evaluation.
Thanks, Rosie. Perhaps we can come back to some discussion of that after we've heard some other contributions. Nikki, would you like to say anything?
Right, yeah, just following on from Jim's comment, but also some concern that the view from the HMPPS that's come from this one individual and rehab seems to be spreading across HMPPS to a detrimental effect. And just an example, reference the rehab, we've had victims waiting over a year thanks to the blockages in our local prisons with the work that we've been doing. But I have got some unlocked graduates coming to work with us in April from prisons around the country. And the Unlocked Graduate Scheme, for those of you that don't know, is the HMPPS Master's Degree course for prison officers. That's great because I can completely immerse them in restorative justice while they're with me for 2 weeks, and can send them back with that. But I also reached out to the Unlocked Graduate course, which we used to do some training for, and the HMPPS have taken restorative justice off the curriculum. And it used to be quite a big part of the curriculum. So that message is spreading insidiously through HMPPS, I fear.
Yeah, thank you. Mixed experiences there, and unfortunately. Catherine.
Kia ora, I'm speaking from New Zealand, so thank you for doing this online, so I get the opportunity to be up late to be able to take part in today. I just wanted to echo what Geoff and other panelists have said about the legislative status and the kind of embedding it in policy being important. I thought the New Zealand example might be a useful one to compare to. So we have quite strong legislative status post-sentence and for use of RJ in prisons in New Zealand, but we still have all the same issues around organisational culture, around difficulty with accessing restorative justice in prison. And I think it battles against restorative justice is seen as just so secondary to the kind of central work of prisons over here. And so it doesn't gain that kind of priority. So it always kind of gets pushed aside. And I think one of the tensions is that because it's always combating with that broader criminal justice kind of punitive culture or punitive impulse, as Geoff talked about right at the beginning. So I just wanted to echo, I agree, Geoff, with the need for legislative status, but I also just wanted to highlight that it doesn't solve all those kind of other issues that are still there with organisational culture and top-down resistance and access and things like that. And I think it's just part of that broader tension between restorative justice and the kind of use of it in a kind of more punitive space. I think one of the interesting developments that's happening in New Zealand is that while we still try and do some work with victims and meeting offenders in prison, there's been a move to that kind of more peer mentoring kind of approach, and looking at how does restorative values, how might they work with those that are incarcerated as part of their planning to reintegrate into the community, back into their families. So we've brought restorative type panels or values into working with their whānau, their families, with those that are incarcerated. So that importance of the kind of the voice of those that are living through their incarceration being important. So thank you for the opportunity to participate.
Thanks, Catherine. That's really, really helpful. Dominic, if we come to you, and then we'll hope to have a couple of minutes briefly to maybe have a little bit of discussion about some of the points that were raised.
Yeah, thank you. I'm a prison chaplain in Sussex. I was really struck by Geoff's very early comment about cultural change and that 40-year sort of process that somebody prescribed or prophesied. So I've recently completed a master's in a theological master's, but it is looking at cultural change in prison, particularly looking at changing culture towards restorative thinking, restorative action. So, and I just, one of the things I identified was that there's an overemphasis on program. And I'm not sure you can separate it, but an overemphasis on programs. So we talk about restorative justice programs, and actually what we've all been talking about is the need for that cultural change, for people to be able to empathise, for people to be able to be genuinely be accountable for their actions and their and whatever retribution, whatever compensation. So I was really encouraged what Cheryl mentioned, I think just in the chat about access to the early formation of staff in prison, because I think that's really key. And so starting regardless of staff turnover, because as somebody mentioned, staff move often to other jails, and so they're potentially taking good practice to another place to seed there. But I just think the opportunity for us to have conversation. I was encouraged to see Joy had set up this in a circle, this conversation as a circle process. But, I'm very interested in that. There's something called Way of Counsel. It's used extensively in the States, New Zealand also, I believe, in the criminal justice system. So kind of rambles really, but no, I think it's very positive. And 40 years, we've still got, as Geoff said, 20 years. Lots of good work to happen. If anyone's interested in reading my dissertation, I'll put my email up there, and you can email me and I'll ping it off to you. But thank you.
Please do, Dominic. That'd be really fascinating. I've just written a note myself, so I'll be interested to email you to read about your work. Lindsay, I know, had her hand up, but then seems to have dropped off. So if Lindsay, if you're there, please do say something. But I'm aware that you may have dropped off the call.
Hi, Nikki, can you hear me? Sorry, Joy, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm very lucky to work for a private prison. So I work for Sodexo, and I'm employed at HMP Peterborough. So we are the only dual prison that has a male and female prison on the same site. But yeah, I'm their restorative approaches and restorative justice manager. I just want to say that please keep doing this, because we are living proof that you can embed restorative justice and you can embed a restorative culture in your prison. Our violence are much lower compared to other prisons. Our staff retention is good, but the way that we have done it is very much is that the prison have me. I think very much with a lot of the culture changes that prison try to do, when you have an outside organisation come in, the culture of prisons is that it's kind of, oh, how do you know? So I do think it has to be led by a prison member of staff, because working with RJ service providers, with that partnership, with especially RJ practitioners, we have a program where they can come in and learn about prisons, because it's such a community. You have so many different departments. And actually, when you're working with offenders, but as well as I've had to go out to victim services as well to learn about the victim, it does need to be run within prison and by prison staff, and then those policies set up. But yeah, if anybody would like any information or anything like that, let us know, because we are a restorative prison. Our other prisons now, so based on our successes and evidence, we now do the same in our Bronzefield prison, so a female prison, and then also in Forest Bank, our male prison in Manchester. So if anybody wants any advice or anything like that, we have all the policies, we have all the processes. Complex and sensitive cases, we hold those meetings in the prison. We have a process for absolutely everything.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And for those of you who weren't aware, last year we actually did an event with Lindsay and others about restorative justice in private prisons and what they have put into place there. So you can find the recording of that, if I remember right. I think it is on our website. So I've just put a link in the chat if anyone wants to look that up, if you weren't at that event last year or interested to find out a little bit about what they've done there. We are unfortunately reaching the end of the time today, and so I want to respect everyone's time. I'm sure we could keep talking about this for a very long time, and perhaps we can schedule in some other follow-up events to have some more of these discussions. But thank you so much to everyone who's taken part, particularly to our 4 sort of initial inner circle members. Thank you as well to everyone else who's contributed some thoughts. I know I found it very interesting, and I'd be really interested to continue to explore this, and specifically that kind of practical question of what's next, what can we do together, you know, as Rosie said, you know, are there things that we can practically do to join forces, to share stories, to try to really influence people's ways of thinking in the powers that be. So yeah, watch this space, because hopefully we can help to facilitate some more discussions about that in the future, as this is something we'd really like to continue to think about. A couple of brief things for me before we close today. We would really love to have your input on how today has gone, and I've just put a link to an evaluation form in the chat. So it would really, really help us to plan our future events and just to know what's useful for you if you could fill that out. So if you just click on that link, then even when we close the Zoom call, then you'll have that up in your browser. So I encourage you to click that link now and then fill it out. And even once I've closed the call, that'd be really, really helpful. I think someone said, can Lindsay post her email address? I think she's just put it in the chat. I think it might just be a bit lost in the chat, but if you have a look. I will also send out a follow-up email after this with a link to the recording, but also some other resources. So if there's also anything that you would like me to include in that, anything from your perspective that might be useful to share, please send that to me, and then probably early next week I'll send that around. So please do send me any resources. Our next event will be in March, and will be on restorative policing, what's next. So obviously some overlap, but a different setting, a different context. So we don't have the booking link live for that yet. We're still confirming some of the final details, but the date and time is up for that now. So check our events page, and if you're not already on our mailing list, please do send me an email and I can get you added to that list, or you can also click on this link. So I'm just finding it if you just want to sign up, and that way you'll definitely get all of the details on our future events. So I need to wrap up there to let you all go. Hopefully have some lunch if you're in the UK time zone, if you haven't already, and lovely to see you all here, and hope to see you soon. Thank you.